have a wonderful packed morning for you. And to start us off, I'm going to introduce again someone you already know, President Travis of John Jay College, to begin our proceedings.
Thank you, Steve. So good morning, everyone. And we'll get a good night's sleep after last night's festivities. I tell you, that celebration we had last night of spectacular journalism, the awards that we gave to our colleagues from South Carolina and to Jennifer Gonnerman, and the talk by Maria Hinojosa was just elevating. It was just made you feel like good things can happen in the world, right? There are good folks doing good work, and it can make a difference. It was really great, and I congratulate Steve and the team at the Center of Media, Crime, and Justice for now 10 years doing this very important work. I'm here just for a short time to do something that is a great treat for me, and that's to introduce Ken Thompson. So let me just tell you why I think this is important for me personally, for John Jay, and for the audience here. So for me personally is sort of easy because Ken and I have known each other for a number of years. We've collaborated on a number of adventures having to do with criminal justice policy and having to do with the role of John Jay in the world. But this is also important for John Jay because this district attorney is a graduate of this college. So he's one of our alumni, very proud of him. And we know that there are many more who are following. Yeah, right there. Let's sing along here.
E.T.
There are many more following in his footsteps because he's been also a supporter of our Pre-Law Institute, which is graduating many students going off to law schools around the country with very strong financial packages, which is important these days. But let me put this in a bigger context. There is a new breed of DA in the country. John Chisholm is one. There are others I won't name, but the person you're about to hear from is one of them. So how would you characterize this new breed? They're people willing to take chances, people who do more than just count notches on the belt and conviction percentages as an indicator of success, who use words like legitimacy and procedural justice and even racial justice when talking about the work of a prosecutor, who are not afraid, as is particularly true in Mr. Thompson's case, to not only acknowledge that sometimes the system makes mistakes, but to do that in a very public and very visible way, and to set up entities like conviction integrity units that review old cases, as has been, if you follow this part of the news, this has been a sort of a really unfortunate saga in this county. But also individuals who are willing to take a closer look at the operations of the justice system, not as a system, but as the interaction between people and the law. And Ken is also my DA. I'm a Brooklynite, and so I am very proud to have him as representing my borough, but also really, really pleased to have him here today to be presented to this group of journalists from around the country because of that idea that there's a new breed of DA. So you're in for a treat, and we are really delighted that he's here and agreed to speak at this symposium. And I have to scoot out, but I'm really proud to introduce Ken Thompson.
Have a great day, Ken. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I want to congratulate John Jay College for organizing this important event. And I want to also personally extend my thanks for being invited to take part in the second day of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Symposium. And as President Travis said, as someone who studied criminal justice here and got my college degree at John Jay, I am truly honored to come back and just say a few words to you this morning. This year's question posed by the symposium, race, justice, and community, can we all get along, certainly resonates in the wake of the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and Eric Gardner on Staten Island, and the executions of police officers Wei Jin Liu and Rafael Ramos in Brooklyn in December. The truth is that the question that's posed by the symposium today has never been more relevant, especially in the context of criminal justice. Because even today, we still struggle with the justice system's conscious and subconscious disparate treatment of whites and people of color as suspects, as defendants, as witnesses, and as victims. And we must do everything we can to deal with this perceived disparate treatment if we are ever to realize the community having faith in our criminal justice system. Now, race, and I know it's a topic that's been addressed and it will be addressed for the rest of this conference, experiences criminal justice in our country and also impacts the way a community views its criminal justice system and about whether justice is truly. Polls not only show that African Americans do not believe that our criminal justice system is fair, but polls also show that there's even a racial gap with regard to the perception itself. Now, what I mean by that specifically is that the Pew Research Center in 2013 did a survey, and out of the African Americans that they surveyed, that they polled, 70% of them believe that with respect to the police, that black people are treated less fairly than whites in their community. But yet only 37% of whites felt that blacks were treated unfairly. Now, with respect to the court system, 68% of the African Americans polled believed that African Americans were not treated fairly in our court system. But yet only 27% of whites held that view. And so, in short, there is a difference in the perception of fairness among the races, with African Americans feeling, holding a strong belief that our criminal justice system is unfair to them. Now, we all know, many of us know, that criminal laws are meant to protect us in our persons and in our property. But the legitimacy of those laws depend on society's confidence in a system that enforces it. Every segment of our society must have faith that police, prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys will treat all defendants and all victims equally, regardless of race. They must have faith that that arrests are being made, that crimes are being prosecuted, that plea offices are being extended, and that sentences are being imposed fairly across the board, and that people are being given fair trials. And certainly that those who are convicted at trial are actually guilty of the crimes. Now, as Brooklyn District Attorney, I have a duty. I have a duty to do justice, not just to get a conviction. And that means I also have a duty to do all I can to reform and improve our administration of justice. If I fulfill those obligations, I believe that I will be able to help communities believe that their criminal justice system is fair. Now, this morning, I just want to talk to you about two initiatives in my office that I think exemplify my commitment to do justice, my commitment to improve the administration of justice. One is in regards to wrongful convictions. The other is with respect to how I have decided in Brooklyn to deal with low-level marijuana possession cases. First, wrongful convictions. We all know that wrongful convictions not only destroy the people who are wrongfully convicted, as well as their families, but they do great damage to the integrity of our criminal justice system. We cannot ignore wrongful convictions. Instead, what we have to do is we have to admit that our criminal justice system is not infallible, that we make mistakes in our criminal justice system, and that we make mistakes every day in it. Now, since we play a key role in the criminal justice system, prosecutors have a moral duty to lead the way in redressing these wrongs. Because if we do not safeguard the integrity of the criminal justice system, then innocent people will be wrongfully convicted, and the guilty will remain among us to continue to commit more crimes and to terrorize our communities. Now, upon taking office as Brooklyn DA last year, I inherited a staggering number of murder convictions that had to be reviewed. Most of them occurred more than 2 decades ago. Now, when many of these convictions occurred, New York City was a very different place. You see, last year in New York City, there were 328 murders. But in 1990, there were over 2,200 right here in this great city of ours. Many of you may recall that during the 1980s and 1990s, during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, certain parts of Brooklyn looked almost like battlefields. And back then, Brooklyn alone had about 600 murders to deal with. You see, back then, there was a time when there were so many murders going on that the system was overwhelmed, and that prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys seemed to struggle with all the investigations, all the trials that were happening at the time. The system struggled. And so during that time frame of horrific crime rates, men in Brooklyn were arrested, put on trial, and convicted for murders that they did not commit. All you have to do is just look at this board over here of the men who I vacated convictions on. And I'm going to touch on that. That board reflects 12 men who were wrongfully convicted in Brooklyn. Now, I established my conviction review unit in Brooklyn to redress the enormous and irreversible damage being done to people who have been wrongfully convicted. And I've also created it to restore the community's faith in our criminal justice system. Now, when I became Brooklyn DA, I took the helm of the 3rd largest district attorney's office in the country in size, behind Los Angeles and Chicago. I have over 1,000 employees and over 500 prosecutors. But yet, when I began in January of 2014, only 2 of my prosecutors were reviewing wrongful conviction claims. And they weren't even given real resources. They weren't even sitting next to each other in the office. And so I thought that that was ridiculous. I thought that the people of Brooklyn expected more. And so I began to build a real conviction review unit. And I put one together that now has an annual budget of $1.1 million. It consists of 10 full-time ADAs, 3 permanent investigators, and other support staff. And what I have been so fortunate to have is the person who is in charge of the day-to-day operations is a prosecutor who's been in the office for more than 30 years. His name is Mark Hale. He's had over 200 trials. But I've also been very fortunate in that I was able to convince a very prominent law professor from Harvard Law School named Ronald Sullivan, who runs Harvard's Criminal Law Institute, to come down and serve as my special counsel to the Conviction Review Unit. Professor Sullivan spent many years as a public defender in Washington, D.C. and he also has served as an advisor to President Obama on criminal justice issues. Now, I not only put this unit together in Brooklyn, I also did something else to ensure the integrity of our investigations into these claims. I created an independent review panel of very respected lawyers who are in private practice, 3 of them. One of them is Bernie Nussbaum. And my independent review panel, they evaluate the cases that are presented to me by my conviction review unit. And they can ask for any evidence they want. They can direct us to do certain things. And they provide me with written recommendations as to whether a conviction should be vacated or not. But ultimately, I have the final decision as to whether to vacate or not. Now, my conviction review unit, what we do in particular is we embark upon very careful and thorough reviews of old cases. And we give priority to those cases that raise issues of actual innocence or due process violations. And what we do is we try to re-interview original witnesses. Now, that's sometimes not easy because these cases are so old and sometimes witnesses have died. Witnesses who testified at trial, case detectives, and quite often witnesses have moved on and moved to other places around the country. So what we do is we try to track down the witnesses, and we interview them no matter where they are. We've been to 12 different states so far as a conviction review unit, tracking down witnesses. We just came back from Georgia. We also go and we revisit the crime scene. And we comb through the case file to see if evidence was never presented or overlooked. And we also work very closely with defense attorneys and their investigators because the goal is to get to the truth. And so far we have reviewed 32 cases. And out of the 32 cases, we're standing by the conviction in the majority of those cases. There's absolutely no reason to disturb those convictions. But there have been 12 men who we've concluded were wrongfully convicted. And so I have moved in the interest of justice to vacate their convictions. The board that I alluded to earlier reflects those 12 men. Now, sadly, some of those men are no longer living. Some of them died before they were able to see the day when their names were cleared. 12 men, and we haven't even completed our work yet. We have in Brooklyn about 100 more murder convictions to review. Now, I know that later this morning a panel will discuss Sentinel event reviews and also whether our criminal justice system can learn from its mistakes. There can be little doubt that a wrongful conviction could be categorized as a Sentinel event. You see, in Brooklyn, my unit is focused on re-examining what went wrong and correcting any miscarriages of justice. But as our work progresses, we're also noting other factors that contributed to wrongful convictions to see if there's certain patterns that emerge. And so far, I can tell you that in several cases that we've moved to vacate on, we have found witnesses with substantial credibility issues. In particular, in 3 cases, the wrongful convictions rested heavily on the testimony of a woman named Teresa Gomez, who was a cracked-out, addicted prostitute who was used by a New York City detective, former New York City detective, named Louis Garcella. In cases, we have found upon closer review that this witness's credibility proved to be simply incredible. But yet, she was called repeatedly, and men were convicted based on her testimony. In addition, we have also started, in one case in particular, concluded that false confessions led to wrongful convictions. In particular, there were two young teenagers, David McCallum and Willie Stuckey, 16-year-old boys from Brooklyn, from the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, who were accused of going to Queens and abducting a man at gunpoint as he was getting out of his car in front of his house, and driving the man to Brooklyn, driving around with him for hours, and then taking him to a secluded area in Brooklyn and killing him, and then driving around their neighborhoods, two 16-year-old boys, for days in his car. The problem is no one saw those boys driving in the car once. The problem is no one could even prove that those two poor black boys could even drive. There was no physical evidence linking those two boys to the murder. There was no DNA evidence. There was no fingerprint evidence. There was no testimonial evidence. All there was to convict those two boys was perfunctory, contradictory videotape confessions. Well, we analyzed those confessions as well as the entirety of the case, and we concluded that those confessions were false, that they were based on false facts that the police fed those boys. In yet another case, there was a hotel receipt recovered from the defendant, Jonathan Fleming, at the time of his arrest for a murder that occurred in Brooklyn. But that receipt showed that Jonathan Fleming paid a hotel bill down in Disney World at the time of his murder, at the time of the murder. Now, Jonathan Fleming maintained that he was in Disney World with his children, and so he could not have been in Brooklyn in place to commit any murder. But he was put on trial, and the office fought him and fought his alibi defense tooth and nail. And we convicted Jonathan Fleming, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 25 years later, Jonathan Fleming asked me to look at his case. His lawyers asked me to review his case. 25 years later, we discovered that receipt sitting in the file. That was never turned over to his lawyer. And so the jurors at his trial never got to see that evidence. That crucial withheld evidence, I think, would have made a difference in Jonathan Fleming's conviction. And so I moved without hesitation. I had some of my detectives jump on planes and go upstate to New York, a prison upstate, and bring Jonathan Fleming down to Brooklyn. And we moved to vacate his conviction in the interest of justice. Now, in the wrongful conviction context, it is tempting to just point blame and just move on. But it's more important that we just don't point the finger of blame at the individuals who, through deliberate conduct, negligence, or honest mistake, played a role in a gross miscarriage of justice. We need to figure out the systemic issues that may have contributed to the egregious result. And we also have to analyze whether those contributing factors still exist or have in some way been adequately addressed over the patches of time. If they have not been addressed, then we, as prosecutors, as members of the criminal justice system, need to start thinking about how to make necessary systemic changes so we can reduce the chances of wrongful convictions in the future. Now, as Brooklyn District Attorney, I am determined to get to the truth in these wrongful conviction cases. And I know that that means that not everyone will be in accord, no matter what my decision is. But we must still do what is right. And sometimes that may mean vacating a conviction. Sometimes it may mean standing by a conviction. Both decisions are made in the interest of justice, because we cannot keep an innocent man in prison for a murder that he did not commit. Just like we cannot release a murderer back into the community simply because he claims that he is innocent. Now, in Brooklyn, we initially dealt only with murder convictions. And if you look at that board, 11 out of the 12 men up there were convicted of murder. But I've made a decision to go beyond murder convictions in Brooklyn and to look at convictions that don't involve the crime of homicide, convictions for gun possession, for burglaries, for other types of crimes. But my review of those cases, just like my review of the homicide cases, will be guided by the same principle, to make sure that justice was done. And one of the reasons why I know I have to go beyond murder convictions is the case of Michael Waite. Michael Waite is depicted on that board. He's in the bottom right-hand corner. Michael Waite is a man who came to this country as an immigrant from Barbados as a young man. He came to our country because